The Battle of Geonosis is the standout moment in Episode 2 because it's the first time we see a bunch of Jedi on the front lines. But it's fair to say that this fight doesn't go too well for our lightsaber-wielding heroes. About 170 Jedi lost their lives to a massive Separatist droid army on the Order's bloodiest day for over a century, in their first major battlefield engagement in a millennium. In this video, I'm going to analyze exactly what went wrong for the Jedi on Geonosis from 6 different perspectives, and break down why their rescue mission was always doomed to fail. Geonosis was the first time the Jedi suffered mass casualties since the events of the Battle of Ruusan and the Great Galactic War. First, let's give the context behind the battle. Count Dooku and the Geonosians captured Obi-Wan Kenobi while Anakin Skywalker and Padme Amidala were hiding out on Tatooine. Mace Windu explicitly told Anakin and Padme to stay on Tatooine, however, they ignored him at great cost. Meanwhile, a political storm was brewing in the Senate on Coruscant, as the Separatists emerged as a genuine threat to the Galactic Order. Jar Jar Binks proposed granting Supreme Chancellor Palpatine emergency powers, resulting in the activation of the new Grand Army of the Republic. The Jedi Council knew that Count Dooku and potentially another Sith Lord were playing them, so they decided to cut the snake's head off before it could bite. Master Yoda went to Kamino to gather the Republic's clone forces that were conveniently waiting for them. Meanwhile, Mace Windu assembled a Jedi strike team to rescue Kenobi, Skywalker, and Amidala, and to arrest Dooku and the CIS commanders. He planned to stop a major incident before it even began, but little did he know that they were playing directly into the Sith's hands. The Clone Wars Visual Dictionary states that a total of 212 Jedi fought on Geonosis in the Petranaki Arena. In an ideal world, these would have been the greatest living duelists of the era, with a record of completing combat missions. There were certainly some experienced Jedi in the group, including Saesee Tiin, Kit Fisto, Aayla Secura, and Shaak Ti. However, the reality was that Windu grabbed everybody available regardless of their abilities or achievements. There were definitely Jedi on Geonosis who had no real place being there beyond holding a lightsaber and making up the numbers. Don't get me wrong, because I'm absolutely not mocking their bravery. However, let's look at some of the Jedi who lost their lives in the Stadium bloodbath. Sember Vey was a female human Jedi Master who became one of the Temple Archivist Jocasta Nu's most loyal acolytes. So basically, yes, she was an assistant librarian. The novel Inquisitor Rise of the Red Blade says that while she learned how to use a lightsaber, her work in the archives meant that she rarely trained with it. It's no surprise that she lost her life during the Jedi's biggest battle in literal millennia. In canon, they hadn't fought on such a scale since the Battle of Ruusan during the New Sith Wars between 1500 and 2000 BBY. Between 150 and 170 other Jedi died on Geonosis, including Padawans like the unfortunate Duro learner Favorn and Agen Kolar's apprentice Tan Yuster. Windu made an institutional mistake by bringing these youngsters to such a dangerous environment, although I'll save the Jedi's use of child soldiers for another video. Well, the General has been making additions to his collection for several years now, and if you're anything like me, you've probably imagined what it could be like to own a saber yourself. So that's why I started my own store called Stickman Sabers, with a singular goal in mind. Make sabers that look amazing, being inspired by iconic designs but specifically built to actually duel with. No worrying about babying them, just pick them up and go ham. They're equipped with state-of-the-art pixel technology, giving off an incredibly bright light that will light up the darkest rooms out there. And obviously have that iconic hum, just feels right the moment you switch it on. And for a limited time, if you pick a collector's saber up, you'll also get 2 combat sabers for free. So, if you ever thought about starting your own collection, this is a pretty good place to start. Links in the description, and now, let's get back to the video. In the Jedi's defense, this wasn't actually meant to be a brutal battle, but instead a display of their power. Star Wars: Battles That Changed the Galaxy explains that this was the Jedi's biggest deployment since the High Republic era. The idea was that they drop into the arena, ignite their lightsabers, and intimidate the bad guys into calling it a day. However, Dooku and his forces had other ideas, reversing the ambush. Most of the Geonosians fled the arena before Dooku deployed his army of super battle droids. This was the first time the Jedi faced these heavily armed opponents. I'll talk more about their specs soon, but for now, it's enough to say that their sheer weight of numbers was enough almost to overwhelm the Jedi. Soon it developed into a desperate battle for survival. The recently promoted Jedi Bolter Swan was one of many inexperienced knights at the battle. She had the fortune of surviving the engagement, fighting back-to-back with Stas Ali. In Star Wars On the Front Lines, she shared her experience. She said they should have surrendered, but instead they fought back. Suddenly, all the relatively new knights like me, who mistook our overconfidence for foresight, had to figure out what to do next. If you haven't checked out this canon reference book, I highly recommend it because it takes you through some of the galaxy's most iconic battles with fascinating in-universe perspectives. Anyway, Swan's account proves that this was the ultimate baptism of fire for the inexperienced Jedi. She flourished during the battle and developed into an experienced campaigner throughout the Clone Wars, but for most of the Jedi, this was too much, too soon. Even the veteran masters like Kit Fisto, Coleman Trebor, and Mace Windu himself had never experienced or envisaged something on this scale. They went into combat without wearing any armor or having any regular soldiers in support. We see throughout the Clone Wars series that Obi-Wan regularly donned at least partial armor to protect himself from exploding shrapnel and even stray blaster shots. Meanwhile, many fans mock the unfortunate Coleman Trebor's early death at the beginning of the battle. The Verkmaster confronted Count Dooku before Jango Fett coldly dispatched him with a series of blaster shots. Trebor blocked a couple before taking one to the shoulder and another to the chest, falling to his death on the arena floor. Don't forget that Fett was one of the most dangerous bounty hunters in the galaxy, and a bona fide Mandalorian warrior, so we should give him some credit. Jedi did focus on training against blaster fire after the Sith Wars because this was their most obvious threat. The sourcebook Knights of Fate explains that Form 3, Seresu, became the most popular lightsaber form because of this. It focused on defense against a medley of weapons, including blaster fire and saber versus saber combat. Obi-Wan Kenobi and Luminara Unduli were both notable Seresu stylists, and both survived this battle. Other Jedi like Kit Fisto and Saesee Tiin used more aggressive styles like Shicho and Ataru in conjunction with each other or Seresu. This was also a good fit for an intense battle, even if it's impossible to replicate the chaotic intensity in training. Bolter Swan owed her survival to her use of Jim-So, combined with the anti-blaster variant of Xian. She favored redirecting shots back at enemies rather than simply blocking fire, and was excellent at counterattacking. The high casualty rate is likely because many Jedi unfortunately favored Form 6, Nieman. On paper, this was one of the most balanced lightsaber styles, but I would describe it as rudimentary. This also made it the preferred form of Jedi who weren't particularly interested in fighting, including diplomats, archivists, and deep philosophers. In Jedi vs. Sith, the essential guide to the Force, Master Sindralik says the Jedi Council maintains that Form 6 best suits the role of contemporary Jedi Knights. After all, a Jedi Knight who's overly trained in martial combat might be at a loss to resolve a complex political conflict or a sensitive trade disagreement. This says everything you need to know about the form, and it's quite ironic that almost none of the Jedi Council use it as their main stylistic base, although some did master it, including Anakin Skywalker, Mace Windu, and Yoda. However, the StarWars.com article Fight Saber, Mastering the Art of the Lightsaber says that every Jedi who used this form on Geonosis died. That's pretty damning, and it's also heavily implied that this was Coleman Trebor's preferred style because he was one of the greatest Jedi mediators of his era. Nieman was completely unsuited to arena combat against so many foes at once. It would have been fascinating to see someone like Pong Krell on Geonosis, because he wielded his two double-bladed lightsabers with devastating effectiveness during the Clone Wars, including against his own forces on Umbara in the Clone Wars. The Jedi also found themselves in a killing pit. Enemies surrounded them from above on all sides with a devastating onslaught of fire that even the best saber users struggled to survive. There was no cover available in the open arena, so their only defense was their skill with a lightsaber. Again, in On the Front Lines, Butler Swan explained, "I let my saber training take over. My muscles moved by themselves as I unconsciously ran the sweeping and batting exercise that is blaster deflection. My brain, however, was racing at light speed. Events moved alarmingly fast, and they weren't moving in our favor." This was a baptism of fire beyond anything the Jedi could have imagined after millennia of peace and security and their abilities as the greatest warriors in the galaxy. The fact that the Jedi faced a state-of-the-art droid army was also a major reason why so many of them died on Geonosis. Previously, they had only encountered the B-1 series battle droid. Built by Bactoid Combat Automata, a Techno-Union subsidiary, they became the backbone of the Separatist droid army. The Neimoidian-backed Trade Federation deployed them on Naboo against the Gungan army, but their flimsy design and dependence on a central control computer made them vulnerable. Usually they were only successful in large numbers with overwhelming firepower. However, Dooku and his forces used them very intelligently in the Petranaki arena. Mace Windu dispersed his Jedi strike force around the Colosseum instead of grouping them together. The first encounter a wave of B-1 battle droids whose main purpose is to further separate and isolate the Jedi by putting them on the back foot under heavy fire. It was a clever strategy because it exposed them to the trap's next phase. Next, they unleashed their B-2 super battle droids for the first time en masse. These droids were a much more intimidating prospect than the B-1 series. Firstly, they were much more physically imposing at 1.93 meters tall. According to the Clone Wars character encyclopedia, there are even on-screen examples of super battle droids literally flinging clone troopers away from them. That's before we mention their armament. The basic B-2 model had a wrist blaster with a rapid-fire function on their right forearm, while some versions even had another on its left side. All super battle droids also had wrist rockets that were exceptionally difficult for Jedi to protect themselves against. Blocking a blaster bolt is one thing, but an explosive projectile is another. Suddenly, the Jedi found themselves in an extreme situation that none of them had ever trained for. Yes, Jedi can deflect blaster bolts with their lightsabers, but they're not invincible. A Ceresu stylist has a better chance because of the emphasis on defense, but each Jedi had to be lucky all of the time, while the droids only had to be lucky once. The final type of infantry droid on Geonosis was the droideka, or destroyer droid. These saw limited action in the Petranaki arena, but they were ruthlessly effective. The first time Star Wars fans encountered droidekas was in The Phantom Menace, when a trio was more than match for Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi. The Complete Visual Dictionary explains that they had twin heavy blaster cannons that produced a devastating onslaught. Their bronzium armor protected their internal systems, but even more important was their external shield generator that made them almost invulnerable to handheld blaster bolts and even lightsaber strikes. Their polarized shields also allowed them to fire while the generator was active. Now imagine putting a random Padawan in front of one of these brutal machines. It was never going to end well. I should also mention that some Geonosians also fought in the battle. Their sonic weapons were particularly effective because they were almost impossible for the Jedi to block with their lightsabers. Inquisitor Rise of the Red Blade even reveals that one Geonosian even fried the Duros Jedi Vorn with a static pike in the battle. Another key reason why the droid army represented such a threat to the Jedi was that they couldn't detect its presence. Droids are obviously non-sentient artificial beings outside of the Force. The Sith were deliberately shrouding the Force, but even they might have struggled to hide a living army. There are no official figures in canon, but various legend sources say that there were between several 100,000 and over 1 million battle droids in the first Battle of Geonosis, including 100,000 super battle droids and 3,000 droidekas. These figures aren't official, but they're fairly consistent with what we see on screen in Episode 2, so I think it's fair to use them as an estimate. Don't forget that the Petranaki arena was literally above a droid foundry, so they had almost unlimited numbers. In Attack of the Clones, Mace Windu has one of the most tragically ironic lines in Star Wars canon when he tells Chancellor Palpatine, "We're keepers of the peace, not soldiers." Windu is one of the most awesome Jedi in the franchise, but this movie doesn't really flatter his decision-making. Those words came back to haunt him later, when the Clone Wars truly kicked in earnest. In fairness to Windu, he went to Geonosis hoping to preserve the Jedi's mission as it had been for over 1,000 years. I've already spoken at length about the different types of Jedi who went to their doom on Geonosis, so now let's look at the Order as an entity and how they wound up in a position they should never have been in. The Jedi themselves barely survived the Sith War, but believed that their foes were now extinct. This allowed them to focus on philosophy and peacekeeping as they strove to be beacons of light and justice in the galaxy. Throughout Legends and canon, we see many examples of the Jedi intervening in planetary disputes. They consistently tried to prevent wars from igniting and were often successful. The Phantom Menace kicks off with a classic example of a Jedi Master and his Padawan attempting to renegotiate on behalf of the Republic in what's initially framed as a trade dispute. In the Legends series Tales of the Jedi, Ulic Qel-Droma and Master Arca Jeth attempted to mediate a planetary civil war on Onderon about 5,000 years BBY. They also tried to restore diplomacy and political legitimacy before the violence kicked off. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan engaged in another diplomatic mission in the canon novel Master and Apprentice as they arbitrated treaty disputes involving hyperspace rights. This was all fairly standard for the Jedi for centuries before the Clone Wars, and they were increasingly comfortable in the role. Some Jedi lost their lives on these ventures, but rarely in significant numbers. The Jedi were never meant to be battlefield commanders, and they weren't particularly good at it either. We don't even have to go deep into the Clone Wars to see this. A glance at the Battle of Geonosis shows their dubious tactics. Yoda arrived with legions of clone troopers to save the surviving Jedi, but lost thousands of them in the process. He had a fleet of Acclamator-class cruisers with him, but instead of raining down hellfire on the CIS ships and ground forces from orbit, he opted to land them, rendering the ships entirely useless. Geonosis didn't have any planetary shields, so this makes no sense. There were a lot of incredibly dumb moments in this battle, but this one is particularly special. Also, it's notable how few Jedi and troopers attempt to pursue Count Dooku and Poggle the Lesser, the two CIS leaders on the ground, nor do they decisively destroy the droid factories. Yes, you know, the ones that are producing the battle droids that keep shooting their clone troopers? It's completely illogical, but at the same time, none of the Jedi have any battlefield strategic experience or have commanded massive forces before. Later, they establish close relationships with their clone commanders like Cody or Rex, as well as space officers like Admiral Wolf Yularen. This was crucial because these specialists balanced the Jedi's strategic inadequacies. Let's talk about how the Jedi wound up in this unwanted position. The Sith deviously but brilliantly manipulated them into their own self-destruction. Darth Sidious patiently played this game for decades. The beginning of The Phantom Menace shows how he was already weakening the Republic's structures by strengthening the influence of greedy corporations like the Trade Federation across the galaxy. Perhaps the craziest aspect of the entire Clone Wars is that Sidious is playing both sides. His apprentice Count Dooku, aka Darth Tyrannus, gathers an ideologically connected group of disaffected systems neglected by the Republic. The Jedi Sifo Dyas threatened to ruin their plans because he recognized there was a dark threat in the galaxy and foresaw a massive conflict. He secretly commissioned the clone army on Kamino. This was actually a massive threat to Palpatine's plan, so he had Dooku murder him before taking advantage of his glorious opportunity. In another timeline, Sifo Dyas may have saved billions of beings. Palpatine's original plan didn't involve a massive clone army at all. He was ready to play the long game by engineering Senate gridlock, corporate overreach, and outer rim chaos. This would have been enough for the Senate to grant him emergency powers and commence his militarization of the galaxy before targeting the Jedi. We see in the Clone Wars episode Pursuit of Peace that his strategy is incredibly fragile. Padme Amidala attempted to sponsor a bill that would reduce military spending and increase humanitarian relief. He muses quietly that a single vote could undo decades of scheming, showing that it's not the Jedi he feared, but democracy. This is a short scene, but it's one of the most insightful and powerful involving the Sith Lord on screen because he acknowledges his vulnerability. However, he's also contemptuous of the Jedi Order and is more than happy to destroy them when possible. Palpatine knows they're going to Geonosis, so Dooku and his Separatist forces are ready for them when they arrive. He also wants Yoda and his clone legions to engage with the droid army to properly ignite the galactic conflict. Now I want to examine some previous and subsequent Jedi disasters and compare them to what went wrong on Geonosis. Let's start with the 7th Battle of Ruusan about 1000 BBY in Legends. This was the final engagement of the New Sith Wars and the last major battle involving Jedi until Geonosis. The expanded universe novel Darth Bane: Path of Destruction says that about 100 Jedi died in this head-to-head clash with the Brotherhood of Darkness. Darth Bane betrayed his fellow dark side followers because he wanted to reform the Sith. He believed that the best way for them to survive was to diminish their numbers and to reform in secret. Although this battle is mentioned on screen, including in The Phantom Menace, the Darth Bane novel is no longer fully canon. Nonetheless, this was a conventional clash between Force users that the Jedi themselves barely survived. They still suffered fewer losses than at Geonosis, although many thousands died throughout the war as an entity. The Star Wars Encyclopedia says that Lightsaber Form 2 Makashi fell out of fashion after this battle. Noted for its elegance and effectiveness in saber versus saber duels, this was Count Dooku's preferred style. The last time the Jedi experienced a significant loss of life before Geonosis was during the events of the Acolyte. This was against Kimar, aka the Stranger, whose cortosis ore-infused helmet and dual lightsabers devastated a team of Jedi on Kofar. Kimir had also assassinated multiple Jedi Masters, although the Order covered these events up. A better comparison to Geonosis was the Mandalorian Wars, almost 4,000 BBY in the Legends continuity. This conflict pitted the Jedi against more conventional weapons, similar to those they would face in the Clone Wars. However, the Mandalorians were very different from the Separatist droid forces because they were extremely adaptable and effective in one-on-one conflict. The Mandalorians developed anti-Jedi Beskar armor and weapons that made them a serious threat to the Order. Again, it was a major divergence from the Clone Wars, where the Jedi faced massive numbers and heavy firepower. The Mandalorian Wars occur in the Knights of the Old Republic game and KOTOR comics and remain one of the most epic in Star Wars lore. To sum up, the Jedi usually expected to fight other Force users in major conflicts from the Great Hyperspace War onward. The Mandalorians were an exception, but even they were honorable warriors who would fight in single combat with the Jedi. Also, they were not innumerable, so casualties mattered to them. In contrast, the Separatist droid armies were merciless, unfeeling, and most dangerous of all, they were disposable. They just kept coming and coming in, wave after wave, without any emotion. Then throw in the fact that Palpatine never intended them to win, and you can see why the Jedi were up against something more existentially dangerous to their existence than almost any previous threat. Even when they faced the Sith, they knew that the Force always strove for balance. But the droid forces were outside of the Force, and they weren't prepared for that. Technically, the Republic won the first Battle of Geonosis, but the Jedi Order was definitely the biggest loser. Their institutional complacency was one of the biggest reasons why events went down this way. It's startling how close-minded they are to potential threats. In The Phantom Menace, Ki-Adi-Mundi, one of the most intelligent Jedi, infamously dismisses the potential threat of the Sith, saying they've been extinct for a millennium. Ironically, the Jedi duo of Obi-Wan and Yoda would adopt a very similar strategy to the Rule of Two after Order 66. Anyway, it's fair to say that the Jedi sleepwalked into a disaster. It's not that the signs weren't there. It all kicked off in The Acolyte, where we literally see Darth Plagueis on screen for the first time, confirming his existence in canon. Personally, if I knew that a bunch of Jedi had been assassinated or mass murdered, I'd want to look into it. But the truth threatened Jedi legitimacy and would potentially destabilize the Order and the Greater Republic, so they opted to treat it as an internal matter and train themselves to look away from uncomfortable truths. This was one of the reasons why Ahsoka Tano quit the Order in the Clone Wars series. The Jedi also prided itself on conformity and frowned upon innovation or independent thought. That's why they branded the likes of Qui-Gon Jinn in The Phantom Menace as Mavericks. They were useful in some situations, but as Obi-Wan tiredly notes, his master would never be selected for the Jedi Council despite his experience and service to the Order. The Jedi were inflexible and gradually grew to believe that they were infallible. As Bolter Swan said in On the Front Lines, the Geonosis strike teams expected an instant surrender as soon as they activated their lightsabers. The Acolyte is definitely a flawed series, but it does show how complacent the Order became during the High Republic. Maybe that's because it didn't have a visible and undeniable threat to keep them on their toes. Ironically, history has a habit of repeating itself in the Star Wars universe. Luke Skywalker attempted to rebuild the Jedi post-Endor without considering why the Order had originally failed. A single student, Ben Solo, was able to bring down the entire project and plunge the galaxy back into darkness and despair, as we see in the sequel trilogy. Nonetheless, the first Battle of Geonosis remains one of the most startling incidents in Star Wars because it's the first time we see how truly vulnerable the Jedi can be. Ultimately, they're just meat like the rest of the sentient beings in the galaxy. Even the Force isn't enough to block a lethal volley of blaster bolts from a platoon of battle droids. Oh, and again, for a limited time, every Stickman saber purchase comes with 2 additional combat sabers, so you're more than ready for your own duels. If that sounds like something you'd want to look into, the link's in the description.